I learned that night that silence can be louder than screams, especially when you realize no one is coming to help you. The cold concrete pressed against my cheek, damp from the late-night rain, and I focused on counting my breaths just to stay grounded. 1, 2, 3. Anything to ignore the tight plastic digging into my wrists behind my back. Anything to keep my mind from spiraling into the kind of panic that makes everything worse. The parking lot lights flickered above me, casting long, broken shadows across the empty rows of cars, and somewhere nearby, footsteps moved in slow circles, unhurried, confident, like this moment belonged to him. I kept my eyes half closed, pretending I was smaller than I was, quieter than I felt, hoping that somehow I could disappear into the darkness between the painted lines on the asphalt. My heart wouldn't listen. It pounded so hard I was sure it echoed off the concrete pillars, giving me away, exposing every ounce of fear I tried to hide. I told myself to stay calm, to wait for an opening, to think, but thinking felt impossible when every second stretched longer than the last. Then something shifted. It wasn't sudden, not dramatic, just different. The air changed first, like the pressure dropped before a storm. The footsteps around me stopped. A new sound replaced them. Slower, measured, the kind of steps that didn't rush because they didn't need to. I opened my eyes just enough to see polished shoes stepping into the dim light, dark fabric falling perfectly straight, untouched by the chaos of the moment. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. Even from the ground, even with my vision blurred and my pulse racing, I could feel it, the weight of his presence, the way the space seemed to rearrange itself around him. When he finally did speak, his voice was low, steady, almost calm. Untie her. Just that. No anger. No urgency. But something in it made the world hold its breath. There was a pause, brief but sharp, like reality hesitated. Then movement. Quick. Controlled. And suddenly the pressure on my wrists was gone. The tightness released so fast it almost hurt, my hands falling forward as blood rushed back into my fingers. I sucked in a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my chest rising sharply as the night air filled my lungs again. He crouched beside me, not close enough to overwhelm, just enough to reach, and his hands, steady, precise, adjusted the loosened ties, making sure nothing cut deeper than it had to. It didn't match the situation. Nothing about him did. I turned my head slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time, and everything inside me stilled. Not safe. Not yet. But different. Controlled. Intentional. You're still breathing, he said quietly, like it mattered more than anything else. I tried to speak, to ask who he was, why he was here, but the words caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. He stood before I could find them. Straightening his jacket like this was just another moment in his night, just another stop on a list I couldn't see. For a second, I thought he would leave without another word. Then he paused, just at the edge of the light, and glanced back over his shoulder. Stay alive, he added, almost as an afterthought, his voice softer now, but no less certain. A beat passed. I might need you. And just like that, he walked away, leaving me on the cold concrete with my hands free, my heart racing, and the undeniable feeling that whatever had just happened wasn't the end of it. I did not move right away because I was not sure if I could, my body still locked somewhere between fear and disbelief, my hands trembling as I slowly brought them in front of me, red marks circling my wrists like proof that this had been real, not some nightmare I could wake up from. And the night air felt colder now that he was gone, emptier somehow, like whatever force had filled the space before had taken the sense of safety with it when it left. I pushed myself up carefully, my legs unsteady beneath me, and for a second the world tilted, the flickering lights above stretching into long streaks as I tried to regain my balance, my breath coming out uneven as I scanned the parking lot, expecting something, anything, to happen next. But there was nothing, just rows of silent cars and the distant hum of traffic from a street half a mile away. He had walked off like it was nothing, like I was nothing more than a moment he had decided to interfere with, and that thought should have made me angry, but it did not. Not when my pulse was still racing and my skin still remembered the way everything had changed the second he stepped in. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to steady the shaking, and that was when I noticed it, a car I did not remember being there before, parked near the exit, engine running low, headlights off, just sitting in the dark like it had been waiting the entire time. My stomach tightened, instincts kicking back in, and I took a cautious step backward, ready to run if I had to. But the driver's side door opened slowly and a man stepped out. Not him, someone else. Younger, dressed just as sharp, his posture straight, his expression unreadable as his eyes found me instantly. "Miss Carter," he said, and the sound of my name froze me in place, my thoughts stumbling over each other because I had not told anyone. Not here, not tonight. And yet he said it like it had always belonged to him. "You should not stay here," he continued, his tone calm but firm, like a statement rather than advice. And I felt that same shift again, smaller this time, but familiar, like the echo of the presence that had just left. "I am fine," I managed, though my voice came out weaker than I intended, my grip tightening around my own arms as if that could make me feel more solid. He did not argue, did not step closer, just watched me for a moment like he was assessing something I could not see, then nodded once, as if confirming a decision already made. "He does not leave things unfinished," the man said quietly, and I did not need to ask who he meant, the words settling heavy in my chest as I glanced toward the direction where the stranger had disappeared. "You were seen tonight," he added, and something in the way he said it made my heartbeat spike again. Not fear exactly, but awareness, like a door had opened and I had stepped through it without realizing. "Come with me," he said, gesturing toward the car, not forceful, not demanding, but certain in a way that made refusal feel almost pointless. I hesitated, just for a second, my mind racing through every warning I had ever been taught, every instinct telling me not to trust strangers. In the dark, but then I looked back at the empty lot, at the place where I had been left tied and alone just minutes ago, and I understood something I could not explain. Whatever world I had been standing in before tonight was already gone, and whatever I had just stepped into it had already decided not to let me walk away. I should have walked away. That is what every rational part of me was screaming as I stood there staring at the open car door. But rational had not helped me 10 minutes ago, and it was not helping me now. So instead I found myself moving forward, one cautious step at a time, my shoes scraping softly against the concrete as if the sound might somehow anchor me in reality. And the man held the door without impatience, without pressure, just waiting like he already knew how this would end. The interior of the car was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt intentional, like even the engine had been trained not to disturb whatever world existed inside it. And I slid into the seat, my muscles tense, ready to bolt if something felt wrong. But nothing did, not exactly, just that same unfamiliar sense of control that seemed to follow them, like everything had already been decided before I ever realized I was part of it. The door closed with a soft, final click, and the man moved around to the driver's side without another word, the car pulling smoothly out of the parking lot as if we had never been there at all, as if the last 15 minutes could simply be erased by distance and motion. I kept my eyes on the window, watching the city lights blur past, counting the turns, the stoplights, trying to build a map in my head, something that gave me a sense of direction, but after a few minutes it all started to feel the same. The streets blending together in a way that made it impossible to tell if we were heading somewhere specific or just away from something else. "Where are we going?" I asked finally, my voice steadier than I felt, and for a moment I wondered if he would ignore me, if silence was part of whatever rules governed this situation. But then he answered, his tone calm, measured. "Somewhere you can rest." The words should have been comforting, but they were not. Not when I had not asked for help beyond surviving that parking lot. Not when every instinct I had was still on edge, trying to catch up to everything that had happened. "I did not agree to this," I said, turning slightly in my seat, my hands gripping the edge as if that gave me leverage, and he glanced at me briefly, not annoyed, not surprised, just acknowledging. "No," he said simply. "You did not." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a fact, and somehow that honesty unsettled me more than any excuse would have. The car slowed as we turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading into something softer, more distant, and I noticed the change immediately. The buildings larger, spaced further apart, the streetlights brighter, cleaner, like this part of the city followed different rules than the one I knew. "He does not take chances," the driver added after a moment, his eyes still on the road, and I did not need clarification, the image of the man in the parking lot flashing through my mind. The way he had spoken, the way everything had shifted around him like gravity had changed direction. Then why me? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, and this time the driver did not answer right away, his silence stretching just long enough to make me think he would not respond at all. Because you were there, he said finally, but something in his voice suggested that was not the whole truth, not even close. The car came to a smooth stop in front of a building that looked less like a place to live and more like something designed to keep the outside world exactly where it belonged, tall, quiet, guarded in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. And as the engine shut off, I felt it again, that shift, heavier this time, like stepping closer to the center of something I did not understand. The driver stepped out and opened my door, offering a hand that I did not take, not out of defiance, but because I needed to feel the ground beneath my own feet, needed to remind myself that I was still in control of something, even if it was just that. I stood there for a second, staring up at the building, my chest tightening with the realization that walking inside meant crossing a line I could not uncross. And before I could second-guess it, before fear could catch up and drag me back, I took a step forward, because deep down, whether I wanted to admit it or not, I already knew. He had not saved me just to let me go. I felt it the second I stepped inside. The air was different, quieter in a way that did not feel empty but controlled, like every sound had permission before it existed, and the doors closed behind me with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have, sealing something I could not see but definitely felt. The lobby stretched wide and polished, marble floors reflecting the soft golden light from above, and everything looked untouched, perfect, like no chaos had ever been allowed to cross the threshold. And for a moment I just stood there, aware of how out of place I was, my clothes damp from the night, my hands still marked, my breathing not yet steady. The man who had driven me walked ahead without checking if I followed, and that alone made me move, because something about this place made hesitation feel like a mistake. We passed a front desk that was not really a front desk, more like a checkpoint disguised as one, and the man behind it did not ask questions, did not even look surprised. He simply nodded once, as if my arrival had been expected long before I knew it myself. That realization settled heavily in my chest as we approached the elevator, the doors opening immediately without a button being pressed, like it had been waiting, and I stepped inside, my reflection catching in the mirrored walls, forcing me to see myself clearly for the first time since everything had happened. My hair was out of place, my expression still caught somewhere between shock and disbelief, but my eyes were sharp, alert, searching for something I could not name. The elevator moved smoothly, no jolt, no sound, just a quiet ascent that made it feel less like we were going up floors and more like we were leaving something behind, layer by layer, until the version of me from earlier that night felt distant, almost unrecognizable. When the doors opened again, the hallway beyond was dimmer, softer, the lighting warmer but somehow more private, like this level belonged to a different world entirely, and I hesitated for half a second before stepping out, my instincts catching up just enough to remind me that I had no idea where I was or who truly controlled this place. The man stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, not knocking, just placing his hand on the handle and pushing it open with quiet certainty before stepping aside, giving me space I was not sure I trusted. "Inside," he said, his voice calm, respectful even, but still carrying that same unspoken authority I had felt since the parking lot. I did not move immediately, my eyes scanning the room from the doorway, taking in the clean lines, the soft lighting, the absence of anything threatening, and that was what made it more unsettling, not less, because nothing about tonight had followed normal rules. "Why is he helping me?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, and for the first time, the man's expression shifted slightly, not into emotion, but into something closer to understanding. "He does not help," he replied quietly. "He chooses." The words stayed with me as I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with the same soft finality as before, and I realized then that whatever this was, whatever role I had just been placed into, it was not random, it was not temporary, and somewhere in this building, the man who had changed everything with just a few words had already decided what came next. I did not touch anything at first because the room felt too perfect, like it had been prepared for someone else, someone who belonged here, not someone who still had rain on her sleeves and marks on her wrists, and I stood just inside the door listening to the silence, trying to understand what it meant, because it was not empty. It was controlled, deliberate, like everything in this place existed for a reason I could not see yet. The door behind me clicked softly, and that sound alone made my chest tighten, not out of fear exactly, but awareness, like another invisible line had just been drawn, and I turned slowly, half expecting the man from before to still be there, but he was gone, leaving me alone in a space that did not feel empty at all. I took a cautious step forward, then another, my eyes moving across the room, noting every detail without meaning to, the clean surfaces, the neatly arranged furniture, the faint scent of something subtle and expensive in the air, and everything about it told the same story, that whoever owned this place did not tolerate chaos, did not allow unpredictability, did not leave things unfinished. My fingers brushed lightly against the back of a chair, testing, grounding myself in something real, and the cool surface beneath my skin helped steady the lingering tremor in my hands. There was a glass of water on the table, untouched, positioned perfectly in the center, as if it had been placed there with intention, and I hesitated before reaching for it, my instincts still divided between caution and exhaustion, but my throat felt dry, and I needed something to remind me I was still here, still present, not just drifting through someone else's decisions. The water was cool, refreshing in a way that made me realize how tense I had been, how tightly I had been holding myself together since the parking lot, and I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping just slightly as I set the glass back down exactly where I found it, not wanting to disturb whatever order existed here. "You are overthinking it." The voice came from behind me, low and familiar, and I froze instantly, the glass slipping slightly in my hand before I steadied it, my pulse jumping as I turned, already knowing who I would see before my eyes confirmed it. He stood near the doorway like he had always been there, like he had never left at all, his presence filling the space without effort, without movement, and for a second I just stared, caught between relief and something sharper I could not name. "You walked away," I said, the words leaving me before I could filter them, my voice steadier now, but still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "I did," he replied simply, stepping further into the room, his gaze steady on mine, not invasive, not distant, just certain in a way that made it impossible to ignore. "Then why am I here?" I asked, my hands tightening slightly at my sides, because this was the question that had been building since the moment he appeared in that parking lot, the one I could not shake no matter how hard I tried. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air again, that quiet pressure that seemed to follow him everywhere, and for a moment he said nothing, studying me with a focus that made it feel like he was seeing more than I was showing. "Because you were not supposed to be left there," he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that felt less like explanation and more like decision. I shook my head slightly, the answer not enough, not even close. "That is not a reason." His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened just enough to make me pause. "It is the only one that matters," he replied, and the way he said it made it clear that to him. This was already settled, already decided, and I realized then that whatever I thought this was, whatever I believed I could control, I was already standing inside something much bigger, something that had started the moment he chose to step into that parking lot and had not ended since. I held his gaze longer than I should have, longer than was comfortable, because something in me refused to accept an answer that felt more like a verdict than an explanation, and yet the longer I stood there, the more I realized that he was not someone who repeated himself or justified his decisions. He simply made them and expected the world to adjust accordingly. "You cannot just decide things for people," I said, my voice quieter now, but steady, not confrontational, just honest, because if I was already here, already pulled into whatever this was, then I needed something real to hold on to. His eyes did not leave mine, and for a moment I thought he might dismiss it, brush it aside the way he had everything else, but instead he tilted his head slightly, like he was considering the statement rather than rejecting it. "I did not decide for you," he said calmly. "I removed what would have ended your choice." The words landed differently than I expected, not soft, not harsh, just precise, and I felt something in my chest shift, not agreement, but recognition, like he had just reframed the entire night in a way I had not allowed myself to see. I looked down at my hands instinctively, at the faint marks still circling my wrists, and for a second the memory of the parking lot flickered back, sharp and immediate. The feeling of being trapped, of having no control at all, and my fingers curled slightly, as if they could still feel it. "That does not mean I owe you anything," I said after a moment, lifting my gaze again, because that mattered, because I needed that line to exist somewhere, even if everything else had blurred. Something almost like approval passed through his expression, subtle but there, as if he respected the boundary rather than challenging it. "Good," he replied. "You should not." That answer caught me off guard more than anything else he had said, and I frowned slightly, trying to understand, because nothing about this followed the patterns I expected. "Then what do you want?" I asked, the question direct now, no hesitation, because if I was going to stand here and face him, then I needed clarity, even if it was not the kind I would like. He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence I felt the weight of his attention again, not intrusive, but focused in a way that made it impossible to look away. "To make sure you are not put in that position again," he said finally, his voice lower now, not softer, but more deliberate, like each word had been chosen carefully. I let out a slow breath, processing that, because it sounded simple, almost reasonable, but nothing about him felt simple, and I could not ignore that. "That sounds like control," I said, not accusing, just stating what it felt like from where I stood. "It sounds like prevention," he corrected, and there was no edge in his tone, just certainty, like he had already drawn the line between the two and did not see any need to explain it further. I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief at how easily he navigated something that felt so complicated to me. And for the first time since I stepped into this building, I realized something that settled deeper than fear. He was not reacting to what had happened tonight. He had already accounted for it, already adjusted, already moved forward. And somehow, without asking, without warning, he had placed me within that future. "I have a life," I said quietly, because I needed to say it, needed to remind both him and myself that I existed outside of this moment, outside of whatever world he controlled. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, but something in it changed just enough to make my breath catch. "Then we will make sure you keep it," he said, and the way he said we was not casual, not accidental, it was deliberate, inclusive in a way that felt less like an offer and more like a direction, and I realized then that this was not about whether I stayed or left, not really. It was about the fact that he had already stepped into my world, and unlike him, I had no idea how to step out of his. The word "we" stayed in my head long after he said it, echoing in a way that made the room feel smaller, more defined, like invisible walls had just shifted closer without me noticing, and I turned slightly, putting a bit more space between us, not out of fear, but because I needed to think clearly, needed to find ground that still belonged to me. "That sounds like I do not get a say," I said, my voice steady but quieter now, because this was no longer about what had happened in the parking lot. This was about what came after, about what he expected from me without ever saying it directly. He did not move, did not close the distance or retreat. He just stood there watching me with that same calm focus, like every reaction I had was something he had already considered. "You always have a say," he replied, and for a moment I almost believed him, until I remembered how I got here, how every step tonight had been guided by decisions I did not make. I let out a slow breath, my gaze dropping briefly to the floor before lifting again, because avoiding his eyes felt like losing something I could not afford to lose. "Then what happens if I leave right now?" I asked, the question sharper than before, more direct, because I needed to hear it, needed to understand what freedom actually meant in this situation. There was a pause, not long, but enough to feel deliberate. And then he answered, not with a warning, not with a threat, but with something far more unsettling. "Then you leave," he said simply. That was it. No conditions. No consequences spoken out loud. Just an answer that sounded easy, almost too easy, and that was what made my chest tighten, because nothing about him was simple, nothing about tonight had been simple. I studied his expression, searching for something hidden beneath the surface, but all I found was certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself. "And you just let that happen?" I pressed, because I could not accept that it was that simple, not when everything about him suggested otherwise. His gaze held mine without hesitation, unwavering, and when he spoke again, His voice was just as calm as before. "I do not hold people where they do not choose to be," he said, and there was something in the way he said choose that made it feel heavier than the word should be, like choice meant more here than it did anywhere else. I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, because on the surface, that sounded like freedom, like I could walk out that door and leave all of this behind. But deep down, I already knew it was not that simple, because he had not stopped anything tonight. He had changed it, redirected it, and whatever had been set in motion did not end just because I decided to step away. I moved toward the door slowly, each step measured, my heartbeat picking up again as I reached for the handle, my fingers hovering just above it. And for a second I imagined what it would feel like to walk out, to return to my apartment, to pretend none of this had happened, to convince myself that the man behind me was just a stranger I would never see again. My hand stopped inches from the handle. I could feel his presence behind me, not close, not overwhelming, just there, steady, unshaken, like he already knew the answer to a question I was still trying to ask myself. I lowered my hand slowly, turning back to face him, because the truth settled in before I could deny it. "It is not over, is it?" I said quietly, not a challenge, not an accusation, just an understanding that had finally caught up to me. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes confirmed it before he even spoke. "No," he said, "just that. No explanation, no elaboration." But it was enough, because in that single word, I realized that leaving was not an escape. It was just another choice inside something that had already begun. And for the first time since this night started, I understood that the real question was not whether I could walk away. It was whether I actually would. The silence after his answer did not feel empty anymore. It felt intentional, like a space left open for me to step into or walk away from. And I realized I was still standing in the middle of the room with my hand no longer reaching for the door, but not fully at my side either. Caught somewhere between instinct and understanding, between the life I knew and the one I had just been pulled into without warning. I exhaled slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax, forcing my thoughts to line up in a way that made sense. Because if this was not over, then I needed to stop reacting and start seeing clearly. "Then tell me what this is," I said, my voice steady now, no longer defensive, just direct, because uncertainty was the only thing I could not afford. He watched me for a moment, and there was something different in his expression this time, not softer, but more focused, like I had finally asked the right question. "This," he said, gesturing slightly to the room, "the building, the invisible structure around us, is control." The word should have felt restrictive, but the way he said it made it sound like stability, like something designed to prevent chaos rather than create it. I frowned slightly, processing that, because it clashed with everything I thought I understood. "And where do I fit into that?" I asked, the question quieter now, more personal, because this was no longer about the situation, it was about my place in it. He stepped a little closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to shift the air between us again, and for a second I felt it, that same controlled intensity, not overwhelming, but impossible to ignore. "You were seen," he said simply, "and now you are not invisible anymore." The words sent a subtle chill through me, not fear, but awareness, like a truth I had not considered had just been placed directly in front of me. I thought about the parking lot, the way everything had unfolded, the way he had appeared without hesitation, without confusion, like he already knew exactly what he was walking into, and suddenly it made sense in a way that unsettled me more than anything else. "So this is about them," I said slowly, my mind catching up piece by piece. "Not just me." He did not correct me. He did not confirm it either. He just held my gaze with that same steady certainty that seemed to define everything about him. "It is about what happens next," he said instead, and the answer was just vague enough to feel intentional. I looked away for a second, my thoughts racing through possibilities I did not want to fully form, because whatever world he operated in, whatever rules governed it, I was now standing too close to the center of it to pretend it did not exist. "And if I do nothing?" I asked quietly, because I needed to know if there was still a path where I could remain untouched, uninvolved, just a bystander who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He did not hesitate. "Then things will happen to you," he said, not as a warning, not as a threat, just as a fact, and somehow that made it more real than anything else he had said. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, because deep down I already knew it was true. I had felt it the moment I was left alone in that parking lot, the moment I realized that being seen meant something I could not undo. I crossed my arms lightly, not defensively, just grounding myself as I looked back at him. Really looked this time. At the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way everything about him suggested that he had already accounted for outcomes I had not even begun to consider. "So what are you offering?" I asked finally, because if I was already part of this, then I needed to understand the terms, even if they were unspoken. He was quiet for a moment, and then he answered in the same calm, deliberate tone that had defined every word he had said since the beginning. "A way forward where you are not alone in it," he said, and something in that answer settled deeper than I expected, not comfort exactly, but clarity. And for the first time since this night began, I felt the shift not around me, but within me, because I understood now that this was not about being pulled into his world. It was about deciding whether I would stand in it on my own, or with him. His words stayed in the air between us, not heavy, not forced, just present, like something waiting to be accepted or refused, and I realized I was no longer thinking about leaving, not in the way I had been before, because leaving now felt less like freedom and more like stepping back into something unprotected, something unfinished, and that difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. I looked at him carefully, taking in the details I had ignored before, the way he held himself without tension, the way his attention never drifted, the way everything about him suggested control without needing to prove it. And for the first time, I understood why the room felt the way it did, why everything here seemed intentional, because he was. "You do not ask people to trust you, do you?" I said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation, because nothing about this felt like persuasion. It felt like placement, like he had already decided where things stood and was simply allowing me to see it. A faint shift crossed his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to recognize. "No," he replied. "Trust is not useful if it is given too easily." I nodded slightly, because that made sense in a way I could not argue with, even if I did not fully agree with it. And I found myself stepping a little closer, not out of confidence, but because distance no longer felt like safety, not when the real danger existed outside these walls. "And what happens if I choose this?" I asked, my voice steady, because that was what this was now, a choice, not a situation I could ignore or escape from. He did not answer right away, and that pause felt deliberate, like he was measuring the weight of what came next, not for himself, but for me. "Then you learn how to stand where you were not meant to fall," he said. Finally, and the words settled deeper than I expected, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just precise, like everything else he had said. I let out a slow breath, my thoughts aligning in a way they had not before, because for the first time since this night began, I was not reacting, I was deciding. The version of me from a few hours ago would have walked away, would have convinced herself that this was not her world, not her problem, but that version of me had not been seen, had not been placed in a position where doing nothing was no longer neutral. I glanced once toward the door, not with hesitation this time, but with understanding, because it was still there, still an option, but it was no longer the right one. When I looked back at him, something had shifted, not around me, but within me, something quieter, steadier. "Then I do not want to stand alone," I said, the words simple but certain, because that was the truth I had been circling since the moment he stepped into that parking lot. He studied me for a second, and then he nodded once, not like he was accepting my decision, but like he had been expecting it all along. "Good," he said, and there was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just confirmation, like a piece had moved into place exactly where it belonged. He stepped back slightly then, creating space again, but it felt different now, not distance, just structure, like the boundaries had been redrawn in a way that made sense. "Rest tonight," he added, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying that same underlying certainty. "Tomorrow we begin." The words should have made me nervous, should have raised more questions, but instead they settled into something else entirely, something closer to resolve, because whatever this was, whatever I had just stepped into, it was no longer happening to me. I had chosen to step forward. And somehow, that made all the difference.